Most people grow up believing that love means forgiveness, that if you truly care about someone, you should always give them another chance. And while forgiveness can be a powerful act of emotional maturity, there is a darker truth about relationships that many people discover only after deep pain. Some betrayals do not simply hurt the relationship. They destroy the psychological foundation that made the relationship possible in the first place. This idea appears in the deeper reflections about human relationships explored by Carl Jung. Jung believed that every meaningful relationship is built not only on affection, but on a psychological contract between two individuals. This contract is often invisible, but it includes trust, emotional safety, and the belief that the other person respects your inner world. When this psychological bond is broken repeatedly, something changes in a way that cannot always be repaired. The relationship may continue on the surface, but internally, the sense of security disappears. Doubt replaces trust. Suspicion replaces openness. And slowly, the emotional space that once allowed love to grow begins to collapse. Many people attempt to ignore this shift because they want the relationship to survive. They tell themselves that time will heal everything, that love will fix what was broken, or that forgiveness alone is enough. But Jung warned that denying psychological reality can create even deeper suffering. When a person repeatedly tolerates betrayals that attack their dignity and emotional safety, they begin losing something far more valuable than the relationship itself. They begin losing connection with their own inner truth. This is why certain betrayals carry a deeper weight than others. They do not simply represent a mistake or a moment of weakness. They reveal a pattern that slowly erodes the psychological foundation of the relationship. And interestingly,
the first betrayal that often destroys that foundation does not always appear as something dramatic. In many cases, it begins with something far more subtle: repeated dishonesty that slowly poisons the trust between two people. One of the most damaging betrayals in any relationship rarely begins with something dramatic. It begins quietly, often disguised as small lies that seem harmless in the moment. A hidden conversation, a half-truth about where someone was, or an explanation that does not fully match reality. At first, these moments may appear insignificant, and many people convince themselves that they are not serious enough to question. But over time, something deeper begins to happen. Each lie creates a small fracture in the psychological bond between two people. And according to Carl Jung, trust is not simply a moral value in relationships. It is the psychological structure that allows emotional safety to exist between two individuals. When trust begins to weaken, the entire dynamic of the relationship changes. Conversations that once felt natural start feeling uncertain. The mind begins questioning small details. Even moments of affection may start carrying doubt. It becomes difficult to relax emotionally because the unconscious mind senses that something important has become unstable. Jung believed that the unconscious mind is extremely sensitive to inconsistency between words and actions. Even when someone tries to ignore these signals consciously, the psyche continues noticing them beneath the surface. Over time, this internal tension creates emotional exhaustion because the mind is constantly trying to reconcile two realities: the version of the relationship you want to believe in, and the evidence that something is not aligned. What makes repeated dishonesty especially dangerous is that it gradually erodes a person's sense of psychological clarity. The partner who is being lied to may start doubting their own perceptions.
They may question whether they are overreacting, imagining problems, or being too sensitive. In many cases, the damage extends beyond the relationship itself and begins affecting the person's confidence in their own judgment. This is why Jung warned about the danger of ignoring patterns of dishonesty. A single mistake can sometimes be repaired through honesty and accountability, but when lies become a repeated pattern, they reveal something deeper about the integrity of the relationship. And once dishonesty becomes normal between two people, another form of betrayal often begins appearing. One that may be even more destructive than lies themselves: the slow erosion of respect. There is a form of betrayal that is often harder to recognize because it rarely appears as a single dramatic event. Instead, it grows slowly through everyday interactions. It shows itself through sarcasm disguised as humor, dismissive comments during arguments, subtle humiliation in front of others, or the constant invalidation of your emotions. At first, many people tolerate these moments, convincing themselves that every relationship has conflict. But over time, the atmosphere of the relationship begins to change. What once felt like a safe emotional space slowly becomes a place where you feel smaller, less confident, and more hesitant to express your true thoughts. According to Carl Jung, respect in a relationship is not simply a social courtesy. It is a fundamental psychological condition that allows two individuals to grow together without losing themselves. Jung believed that healthy relationships should support the process of individuation, the journey through which a person becomes more aligned with their authentic identity. When respect exists, both partners feel free to express their ideas, emotions, and values without fear of being diminished. The relationship becomes a place where each person's individuality is strengthened rather than suppressed. However,
When disrespect becomes a repeated pattern, the opposite begins to happen. Instead of feeling supported, the person slowly begins adjusting their behavior to avoid criticism or emotional conflict. They may speak less, hide their true feelings, or begin doubting their own worth within the relationship. The psychological damage of this process often unfolds quietly, making it difficult to recognize until the loss of self-confidence has already taken root. What makes this form of betrayal particularly dangerous is that it attacks something deeper than trust. It attacks identity. The person is no longer just dealing with conflict in the relationship. They are gradually losing connection with the parts of themselves that once felt strong and authentic. Jung warned that when a relationship begins diminishing a person's psychological integrity, continuing to tolerate that pattern can lead to profound inner conflict. The mind begins fighting between the desire to preserve the relationship and the instinct to protect one's sense of self. And when disrespect and dishonesty combine within the same relationship, another even more dangerous betrayal often appears, one that works through manipulation and psychological control. Perhaps the most dangerous betrayal in a relationship is not always obvious at first. It does not always come through lies or disrespect alone. Instead, it appears through a subtle form of control that slowly distorts the emotional reality between two people. Emotional manipulation often begins quietly, through small shifts in how conversations unfold, how responsibility is assigned, and how one person begins questioning their own perception of what is happening. In the Reflections of Carl Jung, psychological control represents one of the most destructive dynamics that can appear between two individuals. Jung believed that every healthy relationship must allow both people to maintain their psychological autonomy, the ability to think, feel,
and interpret reality without constant pressure from the other person's influence. However, when manipulation enters the relationship, that autonomy begins to disappear. The person being manipulated may notice that arguments always seem to end with them apologizing, even when they were not responsible for the problem. They may begin feeling guilty for expressing normal emotions, or they may hear phrases that subtly shift blame onto them whenever conflict arises. Over time, this pattern creates a powerful psychological confusion. The person may start questioning their own instincts, wondering if they are overreacting, misunderstanding situations, or being unfair. This process can slowly disconnect someone from their inner sense of clarity, which is exactly why manipulation becomes such a powerful form of betrayal. Jung often emphasized that the greatest danger in human relationships is the loss of connection with one's own inner truth. When someone constantly manipulates emotional reality, they are not simply hurting their partner. They are gradually reshaping how that person understands themselves and the relationship. What makes this betrayal especially serious is that it attacks the psychological independence that every person needs in order to grow and remain mentally healthy. Once someone begins doubting their own perceptions, the relationship stops being a partnership and begins becoming a system of control. And this is why Jung believed that certain betrayals must become clear boundaries. Because when manipulation replaces honesty, the relationship no longer nurtures the growth of two individuals. It begins imprisoning one of them. At this point, many people ask an important question. If forgiveness is considered a virtue, why would there ever be betrayals that should not be forgiven? The answer lies in a distinction that Carl Jung often emphasized in his reflections about the human psyche. Forgiveness can heal a relationship when there is genuine responsibility, awareness, and transformation. But when betrayal becomes a repeated pattern, forgiveness without boundaries can slowly turn into self-betrayal. Jung believed that every individual carries an inner psychological compass, an instinct that protects their sense of dignity, truth, and identity. When this inner signal is ignored repeatedly, the person begins moving away from their authentic self. In relationships where dishonesty, disrespect, and manipulation become normal, the greatest danger is not only the behavior of the other person. The deeper danger is that the individual begins tolerating conditions that damage their own psychological integrity. At first, people often remain in these situations because they hope the relationship will return to what it once was. They remember the early moments of connection and believe that patience or sacrifice will eventually restore the harmony they once felt. But Jung warned that growth requires facing reality, not clinging to illusions. When a relationship repeatedly violates the basic foundations of trust, respect, and emotional honesty, continuing to ignore those signs may gradually weaken a person's connection to their own inner truth. This is why certain betrayals must eventually become boundaries. Not because someone lacks compassion or empathy, but because protecting one's psychological well-being becomes more important than preserving a relationship that no longer respects it. True self-respect sometimes requires the courage to accept that love alone cannot repair patterns of behavior that continuously destroy trust. Jung believed that individuation, the journey of becoming one's authentic self, requires learning when to forgive and when to walk away. Both choices demand emotional maturity.
But when forgiveness begins forcing someone to deny their own dignity,
The path towards psychological wholeness may require a different kind of strength. The strength to protect oneself. In the end, the most important relationship a person carries throughout life is the relationship with their own inner self. And any relationship that repeatedly forces someone to abandon that connection may be asking for a price that is simply too high.